Now that the basic HTML layout has been created, I can start to style the page and give this this particular layout a little bit more of a look consistent with our website layout using HTML5 design as found in w3schools.com. I know that we're going to have a header and a navigation. Like I said, we have the section that contains an article and an aside and the footer. Our final page is going to look something like this, except that the section will encompass just the article and the aside. I'm going to go back to Dreamweaver, and I'm going to start by going to the CSS designer and creating a new CSS source. I'm going to click on the plus to create a new CSS file. I'm going to browse in my folders because this particular one is going to go inside of week 6. I'm going to make sure that I'm in the week 6 folder. I'm going to name this file, well, let's call it my template.css, just so that we know that this is the one that belongs to the my template file. I'll click on save and then make sure that it tells me that we're in the right place. We're inside the parent folder that contains week 6, and the file will be called mytemplate.css. I'll click OK, and now in all sources mytemplate.css appears. I'm going to make this a little bit larger so that I can see 2 columns, and then that way we'll be able to see all the sources and all the properties in one window. To get started, before I do anything with the IDs that I've already created, the code's already telling me that there is page header, page nav, etc. It has also added some comments where things will change or not change depending on how we allow the user to keep access to this file. This now being a template, we see that there are editable regions that have been assigned. For example, the user will be able to come in and rename the title of the page, but later on when we add the navigation, they might not necessarily be able to go and change the buttons that will help the user navigate from one place to another. I'm going to go back to my design view, and I'll click on my selectors, and I'm going to add a new selector. Although right now I am touching the page header and it wants to add a page header selector, I don't want to do that just yet. First I want to define my body. I use the tag body as a wrapper for the whole page, so I'll type in the word body, I'll click on that and press enter. Now I have a new body selector. Let me split this so that you can see my CSS as it begins to be constructed. I now have my CSS open. There's the body tag that's got no properties yet, but that's what we're working on. This particular page, as we said earlier, is going to be 960 pixels wide. So for body, I want to make sure that I am in layout properties. If, by the way, your show set is checkmarked, that you won't be able to see the properties, be sure that that is unchecked. I'm going to then select in width. I'll click where the gray text says auto. That doesn't mean that it's set as auto right now because the type is grayed out and italicized. It's actually telling me that there is no value for that particular property. I'm going to then go to pixels, px, and type in the number 960. That's just a standard width for websites. Later on we'll be doing responsive websites and we won't have to think too hard about how wide we want the specific page to be. As soon as I did that, CSS has now been updated with a new value. My body tag says that the width is 960 pixels, and that's great because that's what I wanted. I also want this page to float in the middle of the layout, so while I'm still in body, I'm going to make sure that I add a margin to the left that has an auto value. I'm clicking on the PX and going all the way to auto, and then doing the same thing on the right, clicking on PX and selecting auto. This basically just centered my page inside of the design. If I had more space, then I'll make more space. I'll just make this a little bit smaller. You can tell now that the window with the pancakes is actually a little bit smaller, but it is centered along the display of the screen. I'll get the second column back, and I'm going to move on to the next tag. Actually, this will be the first tag, since body is an element of the page that we changed, but the tags that we've added, we're going to start with page header. I am clicking in my body on inside of the layout. I'm clicking on the word page header, and over here down at the bottom in my my selector inspector, as it were, my tag selector, I have the body, and inside the body there's the page header. I'm going to click on the word, or rather the ID page header, so that it turns blue, and then that way, as it becomes active, I can go into my selectors and click on the plus to add a selector, and page header will appear. I'm pressing enter to accept that. Page header is now part of the CSS. I just need to start styling it. I'm going to go into my layout properties. Let me expand this a little bit more. And inside the properties, I want to be in layout. And although my width has been inherited from the body element that is 960 pixels, I'm still going to add the number 960. It's not completely necessary, but it will just make for a nicer description of what's going on in CSS. My height, well, I'm not really too concerned about the height. I still don't know particularly what the content's going to be. I have an idea, but just so that when we're done with this particular page, we sort of have a visual of what the page will look like. Hopefully it'll look something like this. Then I'm going to give it some new values. I'm going to give the page header in my recipe a height. I'm going to just say it's not going to be 960 pixels, and maybe I'll give it 150 pixels of height. These are just my notes, so just that I remember later what I'm doing. I'm going to go into my height properties, select pixels, and then type in the number 150. My pancake then grows, and it's 150 pixels tall. And I do believe that that's all I need for the page header. I'm going to scroll down a bit, and I'm going to move on to the page navigation. I'm clicking inside. The content for ID page navigation goes here, and then I'm going to add a new selector. I'm going to move this out of the way. So I'm clicking on plus, and now I have a page nav. Pressing enter to accept. I know that the width will be 960 pixels. And for the navigation, I'm going to give it a height not too tall, maybe I would say maybe 50 or maybe less than that. How about 40, just to see what happens? It's actually kind of big. I'm going to go scale back that to 30 pixels. And I'll make a note of that this is going to be 960 pixels by 30 pixels. You can always go back and change them. This is just text that we're changing. Okay, so that's set. I'm going to click on content article and then content aside, and both of these are already set in here. However, if I look at the code for my source code, you'll notice, as I mentioned before, that those two, the article and the aside, are actually inside of main content. So I want to define what the main content is going to look like first. Clicking back on design with the split mode in CSS so that you can see it. I'm going to then select main content. Although article and aside appear to be on top, these are just dummy text headers. If we look at the source code, like I said, be assured that they're actually inside of main content. And main content then needs to be defined to have a width so that these two things fit in. I'm going to then settle on main content, click on my selectors to add that. Main content will be all the way across just like it has been, 960 pixels. 960. And so that the two things that fit inside actually fit inside, I'm going to give it a generous space. I'm going to give it the height of 400 pixels. So now we see that in the design, the main content has grown. It's now 400 pixels tall. Content article and content aside are still just flat pancakes. They're sticking to the top because that's the way that they come into the main content. Main content actually contains this text, main content. It also contains the content aside, which we haven't defined yet, and it also contains the content article. Going to split this again and show my CSS codes, and I see that main content's the last thing that I did. I'm going back to my template.css, and I'll navigate to see the first of these two things, which is going to be the content article. I think we decided that the content article was going to be 600 pixels wide. So I'm going to click then on my selector plus to add. Now I get the hashtag main content and hashtag content article. These are content article will be inheriting values from main content. However, I need to set it to give it its own width. I'm going to give it the pixel width of 600, and the height will be 400. It can't be any more than that because its parent content main is only 400 pixels wide. Since there's going to be two tags sharing that space, I want to make sure that in my layout I find my float value and make sure that this floats to the left. I'll move this out of the way, and then you can see what's going on. I now have my content article inside of content main, and it's 600 pixels across, and now everything is floating to the left, and so now there is content to the right of it. The main content that I want, or rather the content that I want to appear to the right of it, is going to be content aside. So I'll click on that content aside, select it in the tag selector, and then add the selector, clicking on plus. I now have my content aside ID ready to be defined, and I can go back to my layout properties, give it the width that we agreed on, which was 360 pixels. In pixels, 360. And in height, we will also use 400. So now I have my main content, which has two things inside of it. One of them is the content article, and the other one is the content aside. You'll see that the content aside is actually down below, and that's because it needs to float left as well. I'm still in that property, so I'll go back to my layout, click on float left, and now if I were to see this actually a little bit better, I can see that my structure is taking shape. I have a header, I have a navigation space, I have my content article, which is on the left, 600 pixels across, and then there's content aside, which is 360 on the right of that. Main content has already been defined. This is what's holding these two boxes, actually. Although they appear to be on top of main content, they're inside of main content, because the content for main content is these two tags, as we can see in our source code. Let me look at it. Here's the main content, and then the two things inside. We no longer really need to have the text that is just there as a holder. The content for ID main content goes here. I'm going to highlight that and click the backspace and delete it. Now my next tag after all this is going to be the page footer. Page footer, I'm clicking there, making sure that I select it in the ID selector at the bottom, the tag selector. I go to my CSS designer, I click on plus, and now I have a page footer that I can give it a width of 600, or rather 960 pixels. And the height, because it's the footer and it may be a little bit taller than the navigation element, I'll give it 50 pixels. So just like that, in about 15 minutes, we have taken a basic HTML page and then added CSS design, and we are getting closer to looking like the original layout that we looked at. We have a header, navigation. We have this element on the left that has a section and article. Ours only has an article. And then an aside followed by the footer. Same thing that we just did here. So be sure to save, file, save. And this template doesn't have any editable regions. Are you sure you want to continue? If you get this error, just click OK. Because we're going to come back and actually give this editable regions in the next few videos.